Hey everyone, welcome to season 6 of Time Sensitive. On this week's episode, Spencer is in conversation with the Lebanese-Canadian designer, writer, and climate justice and human rights advocate, Céline Semaan. She is the founder of the nonprofit Slow Factory Foundation. What'd you guys talk about?
Well, slowness, we share that with her, and the new Slow Factory Institute in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which she's creating now and focuses on regenerative design, open education, and material science innovation. All of this stems out of work she's been doing for a long time now on fashion activism.
Which she's sort of credited as starting.
Exactly. It's this term that she started using and really has made meaning of. I mean, she talks about fashion as a political act and that it really is something that crosses a lot of different boundaries. We discuss what a post-trash world could look like, so even get into waste management. Basically, how can we design more ecological approach to our waste streams?
And you got into some of her upcoming stuff. I know about the Garment to Garment project she's doing.
Exactly, which is going to teach designers to compose garments from existing apparel instead of from rolls of raw fabric.
We've got enough.
Yeah. On that front, we also talked about Applied Utopia, which is this other great new project she's going to be launching this fall with Central St. Martin's in London. And basically, it's looking at notions of utopia. How do we apply utopic thinking to the now in a pragmatic way, not in some far-fetched idea of utopia?
Love it. Excited to hear it. Before we get into it, we'd first like to thank our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. Celebrating its first decade this year, L'École, which has permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, plans to open a third space in Shanghai next year. This year, they're also opening a second space in Paris, which will feature a public library of more than 7,000 reference works on jewelry and gems. And at its main Paris space, L'École is also opening a gemothèque, or gem library, with 1,200 stones for visitors to view and even touch. Both spaces will also host exhibitions.
Presenting a vast array of creations, the gemothèque will bring together an incredible selection of different species and varieties of gems, treated stones, synthetic materials, and cut and raw stones. Visitors will be able to interact with the stones, which will be available to students and researchers. In many ways, a living celebration and representation of L'École's collection, the gemothèque is the culmination of acquisitions that have taken place over many years.
You can learn more about L'École and its gemothèque at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now here's Spencer and Céline.
Welcome, Céline.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to begin with this current moment in time and the past 2+ pandemic years in particular. We've witnessed a slowdown perspective begin to emerge, sort of by reason of lockdown and in part necessity. And there's been a greater awareness around slow culture, I think, or at least that's my hope. How are you thinking about this period in this context, and what's your take on it?
Yeah, we just wrote a piece that's going to be published soon on the Slow Factory journal that's called Slow is Beautiful, and it's basically a wink to the book Small is Beautiful. It's essentially the idea that slowing down has always been looked at in a very stigmatized way in our society. The idea of being a sloth or lazy comes to mind when someone says, I'm just going to slow down, I'm going to take it easy, I'm going to take a break, and all of these sentences make us feel like, oh, you're going to miss out. You're going to miss out on your life. You're going to miss out on your career. We're living in such urgency and such a need to go as fast as possible, like fast and furious kind of vibe. And those are the positive things. And slowing down and slow is seen as negative. And it's actually the opposite in a lot of ways. You know, eating fast, for example, you're not even tasting your own food. Eating slowly is when you're like being present with your body and just enjoying the ingredients. And the whole idea of slowing down has always been looked down upon and seen as stigmatized. And we were forced to do it for 2 years. And now we're back to normal, quote unquote. I hate that expression. But it's the idea of, okay, now we need to catch up. We need to catch up on all the things that we've missed out on, which again is so sad, because the whole point of the idea of slowing down is to being present. You know, the earth doesn't spin faster if you're going any faster. And if it did, I think we would all be dead.
It's interesting you mentioned food, because I think slow food, of course, is so connected to this culture. And in many ways, I think of what we might call slow media, or very much in the context of what you do, slow fashion, as these things that emerged out of the slow food culture, out of something that we were paying attention to, really stemming out of and resulting out of McDonald's, the fast food industrial complex of the 50s, 60s, 70s, TV dinners, that whole thing. How do you think about that, this evolution or transition from food to fashion, let's say?
That's such a great question. There is a class on the OpenEDU platform. Open Education, for those of you who don't know, is a free online educational platform that we put together at the Slow Factory. There is a class or a series of classes that are called From Food to Fashion. I think the food industry has been the first industry to embrace slowness or slowing down, or the word slow, tied to sustainability, tied to this idea of farm to table concepts and organic food, eating organic. And a lot of people embraced it because they understood that what I'm putting in my body is health. It's my health. It's my own health. But the concept of what I put on my body took a lot of time to be adopted. So slow food, and the slow food movement was ahead of the slow fashion movement. Of course, we built upon that movement to not only raise awareness, but build strategies for organizations, companies to embrace this idea of farm to closet, essentially. Is that even a concept? Could that be a concept? And sustainability in fashion has a lot, it owes to the slow food movement. In 2012, when I started and I would talk about slow fashion, people would laugh at me. They would be like, what are you talking about? Fast fashion or fashion is something that's frivolous. It's to express myself. It's not serious. It wasn't looked at as serious, but they cared a lot about what they ate, what they put in their body. But I was wondering, why don't you care about what you put on your body? You're literally wrapping your body with plastic, because polyester, which consists of 80% of what people own in their closets. If you look at it, polyester, acrylic, nylon, all of these things contain plastic. You're putting that on your body, you're putting that on your intimate parts, because most of the underwears contain plastic, if not, they're made completely in polyester. And now there's a whole movement of recycled plastic as polyester, and people feel good about that, but it's still plastic. You're still putting plastic on your body. Plastic shouldn't be covering your body or inside of your body. And plus, there's this whole awareness that we had to work on, which is when you're washing these garments, they emit and they release particles into the atmosphere, into the water streams that are called microplastics. And I know that now it has become a little bit more common or mainstream, this understanding that we've ingested at least a credit card worth of plastic into our systems because of these microplastics. They come from the fashion industry, sadly.
And I think we've been forced to think about these systems in a way that's different. I definitely want to get to that in this interview, because so much of what you do is about systems thinking. While we're on the topic of slow, I did want to bring up a conversation that Andrew and I had with the Ashtanga yoga teacher, Eddie Stern, in April 2020. This was for our At a Distance podcast. And he said, maybe we need some regular slowdown days built back into our calendar where everyone around the world agrees, okay, for the sake of our planet, we're going to close down just for a couple days each month and ease back at the pace we're consuming and polluting. And as someone who has been at this for a while, I was wondering what you think about that and how realistic you think something like that could become with an organization like the Slow Factory, maybe partnering with the Slowdown to realize something like that.
Oh my gosh, what a dream that would be. You know, Earth Day was not too long ago, April 22nd, and a lot of initiatives around Earth Day are about greenwashing, you know, like buy this because you're going to save the earth. We'll plant 10 trees for you, you know. What we proposed was, what about closing down for Earth Day? What about not opening your stores for Earth Day? What about purchasing nothing for Earth Day? What about doing that gesture towards the planet? There are lots of environmental movements, especially around light pollution, that are asking people to turn off the lights. Just turn off the lights. Imagine if Times Square would turn off the lights just for an hour. It would allow the whole grid to take a break, to take a breather, because all of these lights are consumed by fossil fuel energy, you know, at the end of the day.
Not to mention it would connect us to the cosmos. I mean, Andrew spoke with Andri Snær Magnusson, Icelandic poet, who did this in Reykjavik, got the city to shut the lights off so they could see the stars.
Wow. Yeah, we had a project like that in 2013, I believe. It was called Cities at Night. And it was the cities that are the most polluting in terms of light pollution, which are the cities that you see from space. They're bright, they're beautiful. New York, London, Paris, you know, San Francisco. But those cities, when you're in them, you can't see the stars at night. It's too bright. And so we raised awareness around that, and we asked just globally, could we turn the lights off, please? And to the question you asked, how realistic is this? Again, during the past 2 years, a lot of the things that were unrealistic became very possible. In fact, they were essential to our survival. Slowing down became the one and only thing that was essential to our collective survival. So when we're talking about realistic, what are we imagining? You know, it comes to radical imagination again. Here about what is it that we're allowing ourselves to imagine that is possible, that is realistic? And comes to the other question that I always get, do you think sustainability is possible? And I answer with another question, what are we trying to sustain? Is it that we're trying to sustain our economic systems that are based on exploitation and on pollution, on legalized pollution? Or are we trying to sustain a new form of living that is in tandem with the Earth's system? Because the way that we're living is completely disconnected from how nature functions. It's an artificial system that exists above the natural system, the ecological boundaries that we live in. And we're like, F the boundaries, we're going to live as fast as possible, you know?
What struck me on a deep personal level during the pandemic was being stuck at home, or quote unquote on lockdown, and being in the same sort of place or space for a period of several months, and actually understanding my relationship with the sun during that time. Because the way the sun would hit the apartment as the weeks went by, not just the days, but the weeks, I had a very distinct understanding of the season, the time of day it was. I knew I have to look at the clock. There was an attunement to the earth that was very different than anything in our normal, hectic, day-to-day lives that we would get to experience. So in many ways, the pandemic, for those of us who are fortunate to be at home, I'm sure many people experience something like that.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many studies that are around that shows that just putting our bare feet onto the ground enhances our internal chemicals, and putting our fingers into the soil. There's so many studies, and there's a few of them, if you're curious, on the Slow Factory channels, on social media, on our website, that talk about these things where you put your feet or toes on the earth or in the soil. There are some pheromones and chemicals that are being activated, and it increases the dopamine within your brain. It's actually an antidepressant, a natural antidepressant that is to connect with the earth. And for us, the work that we do, we really talk a lot about ourselves as climate doulas. It's really allowing people to go through the pain of this whole collective understanding that we messed up. The way that our systems are built are damaging not only to our ecosystem, but to ourselves, because we're completely disconnected in a concrete jungle from the earth, from their natural rhythms. And so when you were talking about the sun, just how it hits on your apartment and you being attuned to these systems, that's exactly, it's at our fingertips, it's literally at our fingertips, the ability for us to connect back with our environment. And there's this disconnection between us and nature. We think, oh, we need nature. We need to save nature. We need nature to survive. But there is a misunderstanding where we are nature.
We're of.
Yes, we are nature. So we cannot exist without nature. We are nature. It's not that we need to save it. We need to save ourselves,
This year marks a decade since you launched Slow Factory, and I was wondering how you view this decade, the evolution of this project, which has morphed in these really fascinating ways.
Wow, when you say that like this, it's been a decade, yes. I think it hasn't sunk in properly for us that we've been here for 10 years. So we are preteen, in our existence, which means we have a lot of question, a lot of rebellion. We're very much the same as when we started in terms of feeling this deep feeling of rebellion, of working with and for the revolution that we're collectively experiencing. We're just a little bit more mature in articulating it. We've matured the language. We've matured our critical thinking, our way of reacting to the news. At first, we would just be in complete reactionary mode, and it burnt us out. Basically, it was internally at Slow Factory, the team was burnt out. We were tired, exhausted. And so we started incorporating within our own culture and our own systems internally a lot of community care, mental health, movement, body movement. We were not moving. We were on the computer all crisped up, like as anyone who works behind the computer. And so we started to change. We started to look critically at ourselves. We are running so fast, and we're called Slow Factory. And we're burning out, essentially. So what are we doing? Can we slow down? Can we afford to slow down? And so we started incorporating a lot more pace into what we do. And I think that's the maturity that I'm slowly but surely absorbing in this 10 years and feeling like now we're going to pace ourselves.
There is an irony about having the name Slow or Slow Down and not actually being able to slow down.
Not actually being able to slow down. And actually, we're trying to slow down capitalism. We're trying to slow down this exploitation of the planet. So we are on the front lines. We are working with urgency. We're basically working with urgent action all the time, whether it's support to a natural disaster, whether it's support to even a school shooting, as we've seen this week, it's support to an immigrant law that's passing that is going to be detrimental of human rights and therefore also connected to climate justice. We're constantly in this urgent mode because what we're trying to slow down is this exploitative system. So it's difficult. It was a difficult realization, especially for me. I mean, personally, I've been, I'm a first-generation war survivor. I live with extreme PTSD and extreme anxiety. And so I am all the time on the go, like being in survival mode is my natural state. So even slowing down on a personal level was revolutionary for me. I felt like I wasn't allowed because I can't afford it. But I think that being here for 10 years and looking ahead and seeing that we're just getting started. I can't go on if I go on just running. I have to pace myself. The team has to pace itself. We have a lot of days off for collective health. For instance, after every tragedy, we respond right away and we give ourselves 24 hours off afterwards, where we're just on the phone calling each other or not, where we're engaging with healing. We had to redesign the way we function.
You've been credited with coining the term fashion activism, and I was wondering how the term in the first place came to you, and when did you realize fashion could be a tool or a mechanism or a medium for social and environmental change?
So when I first started, people, of course, looked at me weird and said, what are you talking about? As I said earlier, fashion is frivolous. It's fun. It's glamour. It's supposed to be light, And I said, yes. However, fashion is a sort of a proletarian form of art. Like it's actually illegal in most countries, including in the United States, to walk around naked. So you are by default engaging in fashion, whether you like it or not. So whatever you put on your body has a meaning for you. And if it has a meaning for you, just like everything is political, it has a meaning on a political level. And that was way before 2016, when the government switched from the Obama era to 45, isn't that how it's called? The era of 45. And so it was before the pussy hats, before the t-shirts of, we should all be feminist. It was way before that time. People thought I was looking at it. It was too far-fetched, this idea that fashion carries meaning and meaning carries action. That's the definition of fashion activism. And I kept on going because I was extremely convinced, having lived in the Middle East, having seen the rise of fast fashion post-war, seeing like the first stores that opened up after the war ended were Zara and H&M and Mango and all of these fast fashion stores, along with the fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King. There was this idea of, we need to catch up. We need to catch up to modernity. So even our clothes started to change to even portray that we're modern, quote unquote, modern. What does that even mean? So our traditional wear were left in the closet so that we can wear jeans and crop tops and all of these things that made us look like modern. And so fashion to me was not only a form of expression, it was a political tool to really differentiate yourself and to have a statement of where you're at on your political beliefs. Especially in Lebanon, and we have over 14 different religions. And so whatever you're wearing has a very specific meaning of what you're trying to say, your status, your religion, even your political influences. So when I was observing that as a young teen, young adult, and articulating that fashion could be used, it's a medium, just like design is. It's a medium that we can use to raise awareness, but also to change the systems that are impacted around fashion. So a t-shirt that says we should all be feminist, and that very same t-shirt is exploiting women around the world in the global south where they don't even get to be paid a fair living wage. How are we being feminist with that t-shirt? Who gets to be a feminist? So all of these questions came around the body of work of fashion activism.
A lot of layers. You've previously mentioned the idea for Slow Factory basically came out of an identity crisis. And I was wondering if you could...
You did your research.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what that identity crisis was specifically.
So after having given birth to my first child, and again, I wasn't someone who was planning to have a family. I was deeply involved in my work. I was working in digital literacy, access to technology, access to information, working closely with the Creative Commons groups in the Middle East, but also in North America, kind of bridging the gap, as we say, between East and West. After my first child was born, I felt like all of the work that I was doing in the digital space needed to have a bigger mission than just access to information for the sake of information. And at the same time, NASA had joined the Creative Commons, and I was just, sitting and looking at these images of the Earth during the day, the Earth during the night, the projects around NASA where it was called Images of Change. And it's a project that NASA has where they're documenting the Earth during the day, but comparing it year after year. And you could see the erosion of the land or drought occurring. And all of these things, when I looked deeper into them, they were tied to cities that were producing for fashion. They were producing for cotton. They were cotton fields or related to cotton fields, or they were related to places where there were lots of fabric production, where they needed water to produce these fabrics at scale. And I thought to myself, these images are digital. They're very far away from us. They're not in a physical space. Can we materialize the immaterial? How would it be if people could actually feel these images? What would it look like? And I began the inquiry in my little notebook. I was actually in Lebanon at the time. And I was like, I want to change what I'm doing. The digital space is wonderful, but I think we need to materialize it. We are too disconnected from the world that we live in. And even now, like 10 years later with the metaverse and everything, we're going further and further from nature. At the time, I had Slow Factory, the domain name, because we had bought it even in 2008, just as a commentary to how everything was fast, fast, fast. And everything that we were invited to work on was around fastness. Like everything must be at the tips of your fingers. Immediately, you have to get it right away. And I started to develop the concept around Slow Factory. How can we materialize the immaterial? Could we be printing these images on perhaps fabric? But how could I be printing images on fabric that destroying the planet or engaging in forced labor or unpaid labor? And so that's how I began working in fashion by accident. It's because I wanted to materialize the immaterial and wrap people with these images, wrap them with the world so that they really can feel connected to it. And that's how basically I started to see that it was about systems. How do I even source these materials? And so on.
Well, it's so interesting you bring this up because it makes me immediately think of the overview effect, which is something you've talked about. And it's something that I think is so central to the conversations we should be having on Earth related to home and how we define that. I was just sort of wondering if you could talk a little bit about this sort of cognitive shift that happens and the impact it's had on your thinking. I mean, obviously, this is something that Stuart Brand did with the Whole Earth Catalog and was thinking about through that sort of early Silicon Valley lens. But what's your fascination with this notion, and what impact do you think the overview effect could have if everyone kind of thought about it in their day-to-day?
This was all about connecting the dots for me. I left my country at the very young age of 5 as a refugee. And I remember seeing the earth from the window of the plane and feeling both disconnected from my land. Of course, I felt deeply uprooted, but also connected in a very big way to humanity. I feel like I've always felt this idea that I'm a citizen of the world, just looking at the earth from not space, but from very high up in the plane. Fast forward a long time ago, many years later, with a deep conversation with my dear friend, Leland Melvin, who is a NASA astronaut. And he was sharing with me his overview effect experience of him being in the International Space Station and breaking bread with people from all over the world, even people considered enemies of the United States, if you will, because they were with Russians and they were with all sorts of people around the world, and breaking bread in space in the International Space Station and looking at the Earth from space. And this cognitive shift, it's almost like a chemical reaction within the brain that suddenly understands that we're all in this together. We're floating in space on a rock. How magical is it?
Spaceship Earth.
Yes. And it could be compared to, taking a plant medicine and having an experience like that, where you can make these connections with your brain that, oh my gosh, we're all connected, we're all part of this world. And we were just exchanging notes of me as a young child watching the Earth from the closest I've been to space, which was a big, big cloud. And then him and, just these conversations have helped me shape a lot more this idea that in any case, what we're talking about here, climate justice, we're talking about human rights, these concepts can only be understood on a cultural level when we are understanding them in an empirical way. We can rationalize it, we can talk about it from an academic sense, but people don't really get it until they live it, in their bodies.
Feel it.
They feel it, exactly. So how can we make people feel this in a way where they open up on a compassion level, on an empathic level, they put their skills into action in a way where it doesn't feel coming out from guilt, it's coming out from love. Those were the questions we were trying to explore, if you will, behind the scenes at the Slow Factory. That's basically all the conversations we have, even recently with the situation that happened this week, with the school shootings and the shootings in Buffalo. it's easy to say nothing's going to change. Nothing's ever going to change. Feeding into this idea of doom and gloom. We've had enough of the doom and gloom. There's been so many studies that looked at the doom and gloom rhetoric and connecting it with apathy, connecting it with inaction. It really does not inspire you to try to do anything, because what can you do? The role that we take very seriously, the responsibility that we have with owning a big platform like the Slow Factory and having this type of influence is we will not be engaging in doom and gloom. We will not be adding to it. And that's also kind of connected to the overview effect, because what we're trying to build is a cognitive shift that it is actually possible to change this whole system.
Right. You have this project that you'll be launching soon, Applied Utopia, which connects directly to this. Could you share a bit about that?
Absolutely. This has been a project we've been researching for the past 2 years, this idea of applying utopic ideas, utopia. So it's called Applied Utopia. It's a residency at Central St. Martin's that the Slow Factory will be leading in October, which we're very excited. There will be a lot of design fiction, speculative design, where we're projecting the public into a near future that is possible, that is a utopic future. And so if we achieve that in speculative design sort of way, can we reverse design this back to today? And how did we get there? So what are the steps that we took? So it's again around radical imagination. It's around this idea that we are not only giving ourselves permission, but we're also engaging with an expansive thinking. We're really refusing this idea of negativity. Like, of course, it's so easy to say nothing's going to change. We're all about to die. We already explored this scenario at length. Okay, there's so many books about this. There's so many movies about this. You know, it's a very wide perspective that has been dominating. But what about the global South energy? What about the global South perspective? That things are not as bad as they seem. And to quote my peers at NDN Collective, what if the best days are ahead of us? Which is their ethos.
Just look at indigenous culture, right? I mean, they've been existing for hundreds and thousands of years in these cultures and societies that self-sustain.
100%. Actually, NDN Collective is an indigenous-led group. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're wonderful and amazing, super powerful group. They recently published a book called Required Readings. And the first sentence within the book is, what if the best days are ahead of us?
It's great.
And that's how we operate as well within the Slow Factory is, first of all, there are more days ahead of us. And second of all, what if we could change everything? Where would we start? What if, to build on the works of so many before us, Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire and so many ahead of us, what if the last colonial cup were to disappear? So what are we building from that point on?
Will failed utopias be a part of this? Because I imagine you at least have to acknowledge that there have been so many failed examples of what we might define as utopia, although the we there I'm saying has typically been white, wealthy Northerners. So it is a sort of particular we.
You know, we are going to allow ourselves to make mistakes and to fail as well. I don't think we've had that privilege to try and fail. As a child of refugees and immigrants and first generation war survivor, I was raised with the idea that you cannot fail. You cannot fail this. You have no chance. You have one chance. And I feel like a lot of us coming from the global South, we live with this urgency and also this idea that we're not allowed to fall. We're not allowed to fail. We have to be perfect. We have to be irreproachable. We have to be at our best behavior. And I would like to challenge that notion and say, we are allowed to make mistakes, and let us build a utopia that falls to its knees. We will have learned so much more than if we never tried.
You're currently building this Slow Factory Institute at Bush Terminal in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and this will provide educational programming, workforce training. There's a product studio, an R&D lab, all of this under one roof. basically a full-fledged factory.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, did you ever imagine that Slow Factory would actually have a factory? And what's your vision for this project?
100%. I feel like I start every sentence with 100%. And if I'm really if I'm really approving of what you're saying, I would go into 1,000,000%. Yes, I feel like the dream of the Slow Factory was to have multiple factories around the world that would be a little bit like a Willy Wonka factory, where on the one end we're inputting waste and we output new systems, new products that are waste-led, designed. That was the concept since the beginning. I remember my partner, Colin Vernon, when he last quit his tech job, and they came home and they were like, we're building the factory. I found a place. We're going to build the Slow Factory. We're doing it. And so that was actually the first step that I felt like, oh, it's going to happen. We're going to make it happen. The best way I could describe the Slow Factory Institute in Brooklyn is basically a Bauhaus for climate justice. It's applying design thinking, applying design as a discipline to the climate issue, because pollution is by design, injustice is by design. Honestly, it did not happen by accident. It's not like the Big Bang and it's like, woo, we have pollution suddenly. It was designed this way. I mean, pollution is legal. This is a concept that I always say, and I'm like, wow, that's so true. We have legalized ourselves to pollute. At school, in design school, whether you're working in fashion or product or anything, you're designing with the authority that you are allowed to pollute. This is just how it is. And so at the Slow Factory, we are looking at it in a different kind of way. So it's applied climate justice within the framework of design as a discipline, where we are implementing waste-led design. So everything that we're doing is built on waste streams. We're taking 5 tons of textile waste monthly, and we are going to be turning that into furniture, into clothing, into all sorts of things. That amounts to 60 tons of textile waste per year, which is wonderful for a small institute like ours. And in the lab that you mentioned, we are building a new material. We're actually not building it, we're growing a new material. And the input is tea and coffee waste. And God knows that New York City has enough tea and coffee waste to feed us in this endeavor. And the output is a new leather. That's a bacterial nanocellulose leather that's called slow hide, one word, like cowhide, slow hide. And with it, we are also growing it to work with furniture companies, car companies, but also fashion companies in replacing the leather that we're currently using, whether it's animal leather or plastic-based leather, with this slow hide material.
I'm so interested in this Bauhaus idea. It's something Andrew and I have thought a lot about. There was the Bauhaus, there was Black Mountain College, there was Stuart Brand Hoy's catalog, there was Buckminster Fuller and Spaceship Earth. There was a lot of this fascinating thinking happening, and then what? So I'm just curious how you're thinking about it in this context of climate and human rights, and in your mind, what does a modern day Bauhaus look like?
It's basically like taking design back. So for instance, a lot of these concepts are revolutionary, in the space of design and in the discipline of design. But design, if you look at it, has been extremely exclusionary from other voices, other talents, other perspectives. Design, as we know it, has been an extension, if you will, of this colonial aesthetic that at Slow Factory we articulated as the oppressive aesthetic. It's the aesthetic that basically overwhelmed everything else. It was the aesthetic that defined modernism. Modernism is a key concept in the expansion of the colonial empire, the erasure of indigenous and cultures from the global south, essentially. And so what we are doing, we're taking back design. So Slow Factory uses Helvetica, but almost like against Helvetica's will. And so the idea for us of Bauhaus, of using and taking back the concepts of Bauhaus, it's not only reclaiming it, but it's taking it back. It's basically, what could we build with these concepts, but from the Global South perspective? What could we be building with these concepts with an indigenous-led movement? What does it look like with a land back movement? Can we implement this? And could it serve us in our mission? Could it serve us in this revolution that we're designing and building? So these are the questions we're asking. And of course, there's always a fine line in taking back anyone else's discipline for our own collective good. So of course, there are a lot of questions that we're asking behind the scenes, but it's actually very freeing to be able to imagine this world and imagine the school and using these concepts of behind Bauhaus for climate and human rights justice. There's something that's almost defiant that makes me feel very joyful about it. And I know from the fact that over 28,000 students that we work with, none of them come from a traditional design background, because design has always also been very exclusionary. I've been personally rejected from every single design school I've applied to when I started my career. And the feedback I got was, you're too conceptual. You need to go into the Beaux-Arts, or you need to go into arts. You're not a designer. You're too conceptual. And I was always like, no, I really want to work in design. And so to be able to build our own design school feels very defiant, but kind of joyful as well. And the fact of the matter is that we've seen so many of our students feel so empowered by understanding these concepts that are otherwise left to a certain group of people. Like a lot of our students are like, but I'm not a designer. I'm not a designer. And I'm like, but you're making so many design decisions, whether you know it or not. You're making these decisions and they're design decisions. And so that's been very productive for us to see that being adopted by more people than just designers.
Yeah, I think design as a term just gets too often put in a box because certain people in power or control put it in a box. Your mentioning of oppressive aesthetics got me thinking of a phrase by B. Ruby Rich, which is prophetic aesthetics.
Wow.
And prophetic aesthetics definitely connects to a lot of your work. And, I'm thinking here of your Landfills as Museums project, which was a way of sort of meditating on what is waste, what is trash, does it even exist? And I was wondering, could you share a little bit more about this? And I think people forget the volume of waste that we create that literally piles up every day, every year. And just to put a figure out there, according to the World Bank, global waste is expected to grow by 70% by 2050. Staggering.
Staggering. And we're running out of land to store this waste. So it's happening here in New York City, actually. Communities around landfills are advocating against to have, someone come in, dig a big hole, destroy the whole ecosystem of that region, dry up all of the rivers to basically bury our waste. So the concept of landfills as museums came about with the idea that, this is like the archaeology of the future. This is what we're living behind. Let's say there is the end of the world. Let's say the apocalypse, doom and gloom perspectives is to happen. And there are no more humans on this planet. Whoever is going to find this planet is going to be able to understand us based on the landfills that we've built, and going to be able to understand our civilization, sort of the complete madness of our existence on this planet, I've always been fascinated with landfills because they're literally the archaeologies of the future. So we pitched this project to Waste Management, one of the largest company of waste in North America. Of course, they didn't want us to go there. So we had to convince them that, no, it's going to be great. It's going to be educational. No one's going to cancel you, because everyone's afraid to be canceled. So we managed to convince them. We took a first group as a pilot project, 23 designers from Adidas, from the community, to come with us to the landfills. And we surveyed them before they went. And we asked them, how does a landfill make you feel? And, sad, guilty, terrible, depressed. I feel so bad, all of these things. And so we took them to the landfills and watched them walk on piles and piles of waste, things that they probably consumed that very day, like everyday object, a cup of coffee, a yogurt, box, a bra, a pair of socks, a pair of shoes, a pair of pants, a box, all the things that you've used in that day, literally a toothbrush, a toothpaste, a razor, a box of soap, all of the things, literally. And watch them meditatively walk and walk and walk. And we're walking on mountains, literally. We have to climb on it. We're hiking on a mountain of waste. And after that, we took them inside of a conference room and talked about waste-led design within even the landfill, because the landfill emits methane and waste management captures this methane and turns this methane into electricity. They create so much of this methane and so much of this electricity that they end up selling it back to the grid. So some of the New York City electricity that we have comes from these landfills. That was very fascinating. We talked about the anatomy of the landfill, like what are the layers? It's basically built like a cake. They also were face-to-face with some of the people behind waste management, third generation, working within landfills. And one of them, I think his name was Bobby Brown, was saying, I don't want to be building another mountain. This is my third mountain in my lifetime. I don't want to be digging up a hole anymore. Of course, this experience brought tears to not only the designers, but also waste management folks were crying, and it ended up in hugs and tears and so much emotion that happened during that day. And we surveyed them on our way home. So how does a landfill make you feel? And the answers were hopeful, empowered, inspired. And they were very much more empowered to doing something about waste than whatever they were thinking about before going to the landfill. So we did it 2 or 3 times, and then the pandemic started. So we had to put this project on pause. We translated it into a digital interface. You could see it on slowfactory.earth/landfills as museums, where you could experience it in a way where we're trying to guide you through the experience. It's of course not the same as being there, but there's a documentary at the very end that also helps you understand what happens when you are to walk and meditate on a landfill. What happens when a designer is involved into thinking about the end of life first, before thinking about functionality or aesthetic. I wrote also about ecosystems over aesthetics. I even got into a fight over email with an academic from Europe who was like, well, they shouldn't be over aesthetics. Aesthetics are part of design. I'm like, yeah, but what if there's no more ecosystem for you to design, Let's talk about ecosystems over aesthetics. Doesn't mean it's going to annul aesthetics, but it's also a hierarchy of priority. Like there should be climate justice, or in fact, it's applied climate justice. It's looking at the constraints. As designers, we work around constraints pretty well. If we were to understand the constraints, I think we would be even more creative.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, L'École brings together teachers, jewelers, art historians, gemologists, designers, lacquer masters, enamelers, setters, lapidaries, mock-up makers, and others to share their passion and knowledge of jewelry with the world. Through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications, L'École makes the world of jewelry accessible to all. No matter one's experience level, L'École opens up an incredible art form that has long been reserved for a handful of people. Through fresh, pioneering approach, L'École sits at the crossroads of art, gemology, and craftsmanship, and continues to and consolidates knowledge around the fascinating, vast world of jewelry. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now, back to the episode. You said you don't believe in trash, and I was wondering what a post-trash world would look like to you. Like, how do we unprogram our minds and redesign our systems around what we deem to be trash? I'm thinking here also that this is a place for you to talk a bit about regenerative design, which is so central to the Slow Factory program.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, such a deep question. I feel like this could be a whole podcast on its own, because we're talking about the gray area between throwing something into the trash and recycling something. Like, what happens in between? And I think that's what Slow Factory, the Institute, is going to be exploring, is this gray area between throwing something into the trash for it to decompose, which never happens, and then recycling it, which also never happens. Like only 4% of what we throw in the recycling bin gets recycled. 4%. That's in the United States. But if you travel to the global south and you go into these places where we are actually exporting our plastic waste to, sadly, and there isn't the infrastructure to support that amount of trash that we're sending there, what we consider trash, because of course it's trash just because we said it is. It's not actually trash. We're using durable material like plastic for something that is supposed to be used within seconds and then thrown away. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't really recycle. So what are we doing with it? There's this gray area of both upcycling and downcycling that we need to explore as a system in society, which the Slow Factory Institute will be dedicated to, this gray area between recycling and throwing into the garbage, of upcycling and downcycling. And I can give you a bunch of examples. For instance, downcycling, a very common example is taking both textile waste and paper and cardboard waste and shredding them and making them into industrial insulation. So instead of using plastic or harmful materials to create the insulation in buildings, that's a solution. That should be the solution. Why are we using, virgin trash when we can use recycled trash to create these insulations? Another example of downcycling is shredding these same materials and using them as filling into our furniture, filling for couches, for car seats. So why aren't we using that? Why are we needing to extract fossil fuel, turn them into these fibers, these synthetic fibers, to be able to fill our seats? And also, they also release microplastics into the environment. We're breathing that into our noses. So those are two examples. And in terms of upcycling, it's basically taking 2 t-shirts and turning them into a dress, which is a program that we're launching this fall. It's called Garment to Garment, and it's teaching designers not to design from a roll of raw fabric, but to design from existing garments. So, of course, the first idea that comes to mind is Frankenstein design, which is basically like patchwork. But can we push the aesthetic further here? Could we work with ecosystems over aesthetic and working with these constraints and push the aesthetic further so that it is not only comparable, but also can we push the aesthetic of upcycling to the psyche of the general public, and for us to start accepting things that are imperfect. And I just want to give an example. Balenciaga just released these terrible shoes not too long ago. They cost $1,800. They're basically really run down Converse. I saw so many of these Converse in the landfills, and I was like, oh my God, this is almost evil and genius at the same time. Because what if instead of distressing the new Converse, why don't you go fishing into the landfills, get these Converse that are completely distressed and sell them back to the consumer, and just create a sort of normalized way of looking at an object in a different aesthetic,
It's almost like an Onion article about fashion.
Yes. But for me, when I saw the distressed Converse that Balenciaga has released, I was like, oh my God, this is genius. Are they taking them from the landfills? And later on, I found out that absolutely not. They're taking new Converse and distressing them, which I thought was a waste of energy. But, that's just me.
A key component of what you're doing, and you sort of touched on this, is climate positivity. And it's so refreshing because I think we get bogged down when we think of the climate crisis or the climate emergency or the Anthropocene or any of these terms and pretty defeating areas of engagement. There still are a lot of solutions-based opportunities and ideas. And I think there aren't enough platforms for that. And so that's one thing that, I really admire with what you're doing. And I was wondering what the phrase climate positivity means to you and the impact of this kind of thinking. Like if we could just steer a little bit further away, well, not, ignoring the fact that there are these really distressing factors in front of us. I mean, David Wallace Wells's Uninhabitable Earth is a book everyone should read. But that doesn't mean that we should finish it and feel defeatist. If anything, we should want to act.
Exactly. The whole doom and gloom philosophies are very much tied to a carceral thinking, a thinking around punishment, a thinking about, it's almost like Protestant views of the world. It's around austerity, it's around lack, it's around less. So all of these do not necessarily lead us into innovation, really. You can't really innovate from that point on. You can feel really bad about yourself and kind of stop what you're doing and engage in austere practices like, I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that. And individual thinking would have you believe that if you stopped eating meat and stopped purchasing anything new ever again, you're doing great. But even if you did that, nothing's going to change because it's a systemic problem. And even if 800,000 of you or 8 million of you did that, we would still run with the same systemic issues. It's just the math does not compute. So how do we create change? Because that's the question. It's not through individual action, it's through collective action. And collective action looks like not just voting, it looks like community garden, it looks like community composting, it looks like education at school around climate justice, and then action related to that. It looks like instead of purchasing something new, hosting a swap party or hosting a repair party or hosting a, we're not going to buy anything new party with your whole community, So all of these things are interesting to us as how do we actually change things? And I think it's a cultural movement that needs to happen. We need to look at it in a collective way. But, climate positivity, I don't think we didn't invent that. I think the first time I read it was in a Fast Company article. And I really adopted it for the study hall at the United Nations. That was the theme, climate positivity at scale, because it was just a little bit more descriptive than sustainability at scale. Sustainability is confusing. Again, what are we trying to sustain? Oftentimes, these sustainability practices are trying to sustain the economic sustainability of a given company. They're going to make a small change that's going to make them look good from a public perspective, but systemically, they're just keeping status quo as much as possible because that's what their survival depends on, their survival as a company. So sustainability is not descriptive enough. Like climate positivity allows us to understand that we need to be positive on the climate, Like, what is it that you're doing that's actually contributing positively to the climate?
It's actionable.
Yes, it's a bit more actionable. It's a bit more, you can hold people accountable a little bit more than sustainability is at the moment.
Intersectionality and critical thinking are so central to this, but it does feel like we kind of have a dearth of both of these days. And education's pretty much the most logical and effective path forward. But I mention this also realizing that we do live in a moment of one-track mindedness, career-orientedness, rather than like liberal arts or cross-discipline thinking. And this is to say nothing of indigenous and ancestral wisdom that's not being taught enough or passed down anymore. And so how can we push for greater intersectionality and critical thinking amidst what is basically an MBA-ization of America and a country in which, Tucker Carlson is our most watched news anchor?
Yeah, Tucker Carlson did pick up on a bunch of things that the Slow Factory created, and it got us into a wave of hate mail. It was very scary. We are living in a polarized political climate where the binary thinking is at its highest. It's either good or bad. Are you for the vaccine or against the vaccine? Are you for Black Lives Matter or against Black Lives Matter? Are you for gun control or against gun control? And I'm not going to talk to you if you are in this and that. And like, there's literally no nuance available to our, understanding. It's very hard to exist within these binaries. At the Slow Factory, we're trying so hard to create a space for understanding nuance. We're also living in a place and a time where there's a war on education. There's a war on books. There's a war on critical thinking. So of course, everything's going to be good or evil or black or white or positive, negative. That's what we're designing at the moment when we are having a war on books, a war on women's bodies, a war on our borders. We're in a climate of war. We're in a culture of war.
Paola Antonelli called it the age of the bully.
The age of the bully. Well, that's interesting. I call it the culture of war, really, because it is this idea of war being completely inevitable. A climate war, a racial war, a war internationally, this elevation of the military by all means necessary. Meanwhile, the US military alone pollutes more than 100 countries combined. And this idea of weaponized states and weaponized culture is what is driving us into the abyss at the moment. This idea of the culture of war is something that I personally write a lot about because, again, having lived a war, I'm just like, how are we just living in a climate where we're just inviting people to fight one another? The climate in the United States right now, this polarization is very close to a civil war. You know, whether we see it or not, it is a civil war.
Yeah, it's right in front of us. I mean, in prepping for this, took a note of one of your recent tweets, which captures this complex and I should say perplexed situation America finds itself in. And it's a pretty dark tweet.
Just like all my tweets.
But it, you know, it's a fragment and it just hits home. You write, the culture of war, of violence and impunity wrapped up in a white supremacist capitalist layer of plastic, suffocating justice with a crust smile, gaslighting an entire nation.
Yeah, I was very sad about the shootings that happened kind of back to back. The Buffalo shooting, the shooting in Austin. It's just it's so beyond sad. Like I can't even compute, you know, like just this morning, we were discussing within my team at the Slow Factory. I couldn't even get out of bed this morning. I was so sad about everything that's happening. It really hits us, you know, like working within the Slow Factory, as I said earlier, we're constantly within the trauma that we are talking about. There's a book called Trauma Stewardship. We tried to get the author to speak at OpenEDU. Hopefully we can get her for the fall. That's what we're doing. We're doing trauma stewardship. Essentially, we're bathing within this traumatic experience and trying to make sense of it. And so when I tweeted that, it was just minutes after I heard about the shootings. And I was just like, oh my gosh, we live in such a culture of war.
I wanted to sort of circle back to this conversation of home. And we're talking about America, which is your home in the sense it's where you live and are planted right now, but you've lived in Lebanon, Montreal, Paris, and now New York. And you're, as you said, a first-generation war survivor and child refugee. How do you define home?
For my entire life up until now, and I'm turning 40 this year, I've been struggling with the notion of home, you know, as any uprooted person. And I feel like it's a very universal question for anyone that had to flee someplace and had to watch their childhood memories burn or disappear. You know, everything is in a shoebox, literally everything that was able to be salvaged. What is home, you know? And you go home if you have the chance to. Some of us can't even go back to their home because their home is still occupied. But if you do go back home, you realize that you're not really home, you know, you were the one who left. So are you home? I struggled with this my whole life. And in my spiritual practice, I kind of came to the peace that home is inside me, you know, like home is within. Home is my own connection to myself and to my surroundings. I always say that my roots are in a terrarium. They're not planted, even if I'm here. I'm a guest here, you know. I'm on occupied land. I'm on unceded territory. How can I plant myself fully? And when I go home to my country, my roots have changed and they don't fit the soil anymore. So home for me is something I explore constantly. I think it's, as an artistic practice, my eternal question. What are we considering as home? And I think that's where the notion of nature and climate justice and all of these things that are in my work come to life, because when I am in nature and close my eyes, I feel at home, you know? It's ephemeral, because then I come back and I'm like, I'm not at home anymore. So I think it's an eternal question. The best answer for me is home is inside you.
Tell me a bit about your upbringing and family. Like, what are some of the early memories you have, whether that's in Lebanon or arriving in Canada with your parents in the late 80s?
You know, I remember my earliest memories is me in Lebanon, dancing, dancing Arabic on tables, surrounded by adults in a shelter that are like just encouraging this joyful moment to happen, and then feeling threatened, feeling like rushed into a place, and then traveling. Another memory is traveling and trying to get all of the plush toys with me as much as I could, and running after my mom, who was carrying my sister in the airport in Beirut. And my mom's like, you can't carry all this. You can't carry. No, but I want them. And then I'm running and running and seeing all the plush toys that I couldn't carry like fall behind me. And I'm looking back and all of them are falling behind. And I managed to get just one elephant with me to Montreal. And then the elephant fell behind the couch and burnt his trunk on the heater. And I really wanted to keep him. And of course, my mom threw him away as soon as she could, which was very sad because I can't believe she did that. So those are like some of the earliest memories. Going to school in Montreal, I didn't speak French very well, so I only spoke Arabic. And I wanted to teach my peers Arabic. And apparently my mom just shared this memory with me not too long ago. And she's like, you went to school and you danced Arabic and talked to them in Arabic. That was your first day, and they made fun of you and they completely ridiculed you, including the teacher. And you felt so hurt. And you came home and you were so mad at the teacher. My mom was saying, I was like, well, don't do that at school. Like, just don't do that at school. And I was so mad at her. Like, why don't you come in and defend me, you know, and tell them this is beautiful. I carried this shame. I refused to speak Arabic from that point on. Nothing, not one word of Arabic. And then at age 13, we go back to Lebanon. There was the last ceasefire. And my parents, in a whim, within a month, they closed everything, packed everything, and my mom threw everything. We came back to Lebanon. It was a big cultural shock for me because I went from living in North America to living in the global South in Lebanon, post-war, no electricity, no water, and that was okay. And I had to speak Arabic, and I didn't want to speak Arabic. I didn't want to learn Arabic. I just had undealt issues that I've been experiencing and internalized so much racism about myself. I tried so hard to fit into this white world. Now I'm here, and I have this like feeling that I'm better than everybody because I come from a civilized land, and you guys are uncivilized. Like so much internalized racism, internalized colonialism. And my grandpa, who passed away in 2019, was like, what are you talking about? You're civilized? We are civilized. We invented all of the numbers that you're using. We invented the alphabet that they're using. We invented all of this. We invented astronomy, mathematics, and all of this shift in my mind happened with my grandpa teaching me about colonialism, teaching me about the oppression that we've survived, teaching me about the ancient wisdom that I carry and has changed me forever. And I first hated my parents for bringing me back to Lebanon, and very soon after thanking them for the perspective that I forever am grateful for, forever is leading me today. Like I'm literally building Slow Factory with the wisdom that my grandpa gave me, you know? And this idea that, what are you talking about? Who's civilized? Who is civilized? Is military civilized?
Listening to this, I just couldn't help but think that there's this sort of survival mode you also had to put yourself in. First in Canada, and then upon your return to Lebanon. And I'm sort of wondering how being in that space, that mindset has led you on your path and creative journey.
Yeah, it's actually a big topic in the book that I'm writing. It's called A Woman as a School. It's published with Astra Publishing, and it's coming up in April 2024. I believe it may come up sooner, but we'll see. And those are the things that I'm writing about in that book. Is this journey, the journey that has led me to build this school, and the learnings that I've received from my ancestors and from my culture, from the women in my family, in my lineage. It's a lot of vignettes and stories, a bit like the one I just shared. There's also a chapter in it where a childhood friend of mine in Montreal comes with me to Lebanon. And we're in our early 20s. And I haven't reckoned completely yet with this idea of the global north and the global south. I'm still living it. I haven't had my findings yet. I'm still deep in my research at the time. And she comes with me, and she comes with so much entitlement and so much judgment over my culture, over my people. I share this in the book about seeing my country through her eyes and seeing the judgment that she is putting upon it, that we're uncivilized, we're unruly, we're savages, just the way we drive, the way we can't even stand in line to get bread. Yeah, because the culture of the global south is a case-by-case culture. It's not a standardized culture like in the global north, where one rule is unanimous. You have to abide by the rule. And in the global south, we don't have that you abide by the rule. It's a case-by-case, and you can totally break the rules. I talk a lot about this notion of the case-by-case notion, which I think is key in understanding equity. Equity is not going to be a standardized rule that, all people of all skin tones that are all It's not going to happen this way. Equity is a case-by-case rule. It must be something that is from the Eastern philosophies, that has to be understood from a global south perspective. It won't be applied in the global north perspective. You know what I mean?
I'm so struck hearing you say all this, that you must have some internal wrangling between this north and south self. I was wondering how you view your work at Slow Factory within that, and sort of how you see fashion within that too. I mean, what role does fashion, does beauty, aesthetics play in that internal navigation of North and South?
Yeah, no, these questions are definitely things that I ask myself constantly. The Slow Factory is trying to restore balance and creating a counterbalance from the global south, as the global south perspective, if you will. I keep saying that, global south perspective, but one of the chapters in my book is called Global South Baby, and it's this energy that I'm talking about. It's this perspective, this philosophy, the ease with contradiction. I have no problem with contradiction. I'm actually very at ease with contradiction. When you live in Beirut, you understand contradiction on a whole other level. I recently wrote an article for GQ Middle East, and it's about the new masculinity in the Arab world. And I talk about contradiction and the ease with contradiction. I mean, I feel like in the global north, any type of contradiction is like, I'm a hypocrite. I'm a hypocrite because ABCD. I'm a hypocrite. Why do you need to be so hard on yourself? Like, you don't need to be a hypocrite. Like, it's again, this carceral thinking that's very Protestant, that's very much ingrained in austerity. Austerity is not the solution at all. Okay. And it's resulting from this colonial thinking, I don't like that. And I don't embrace that at all. And I've never did. I feel like in Lebanon, there's this joyful defiance of that very colonial austerity. Like whenever we can defy it, it's like a bit like school children, like, fuck you, kind of energy. But like, no way, that's not the perspective. But you must be at ease with contradiction. There is no way around it. We are contradictory beings. Period. Like, there's no purity. There's no purity. Purity is a colonial construct. We are made of these contradictions. Yes, I am, as a designer, super conflicted with how do I reconcile East and West. My whole life, I felt like I was a diplomat trying to explain the East to the West and the West to the East and trying to make sense of it all, in my mind, because I've been uprooted from the East, going into the West, tried so hard to fit into these constructs, came back to the East at a time where I am rebelling. I'm a teenager. I'm like confused. I'm rebelling against everything that has happened to me. I remember my father telling me just as I am about to get married, and he's like, oh my God, we took you from place to place, from place to place. You have never felt anchored anywhere. And I'm so happy now that you are finding your home and feeling anchored. And I'm like crying. I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know if I will ever feel anchored, And I'm embracing contradiction because that's my life.
Tell me about your return to the West and to New York and to this first dozen or so years of your career before starting Slow Factory. I mean, what was that transition back in like?
Yeah, in Lebanon, I had the opportunity to study art with a French teacher that was living in Lebanon. She had an apartment in Beirut, and her name is Poppy Arnold, and she was a French artist who lived in Beirut and taught a lot of children art. And a friend of mine was studying under her, and she told me, Céline, you have such a gift in drawing. I was born with this gift from my grandfather, I think, because he also has this gift, and my auntie. And I always drew. I always was drawing. And she said, you have such a gift. You should come with me to this class, this art class. Of course, I had to beg my parents because they were like, there's no way I was going to learn art. Why would you need that? And we begged them, please give me one class, one Saturday a week. And through this one Saturday a week, I learned how to draw, I learned how to paint, sculpt, everything. And I became very close to my teacher. Obviously, she was such a role model for me. She taught me so much about slowness, actually, and about pointing out that in Lebanon, we have this urgency because we've lived a war, and children are always forced to be, yalla, 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 hurry up. Everything must be fast. We lost this slowness in our culture. And she was kind of teaching us to slow down. All these techniques that we were learning was so ancient, like oil painting. You have to do it so slowly. There's no way it's going to dry faster, even if you use a hairdryer. So this whole idea of slowness, Poppy Arnold, the teacher, said to me, you should pursue art. You should pursue design and art. You should do this as a career. You should go to Paris. So, of course, I go back home and I'm telling my father and mother, I'm going to go to Paris. I'm going to study art. I'm going to be an artist. And of course, are you kidding me? There's no way we survived all this for you to go blow it away in drugs and alcohol and becoming an artist and being a useless person into this planet. There's no way you're going to be useless. No, but it's not useless. It's useful. It's useful to be an artist. No, there's no way you're being an artist. So, of course, I had to convince them, and Poppy Arnold had to come and talk to them and give her 1 year. Give her 1 year. Give her 1 year in Paris. Help her be there for 1 year. And my dad said, you have 1 year. And if you fail after this 1 year, you're done. You're going to go back and be useful to society, to the world. You have so many skills. You have to be useful. You cannot be useless. And for them, an artist is useless. And, it's arguable. But, I was like, okay, 1 year. And after this 1 year, my design school failed me. They're like, you're not a designer. You're an artist. You can be a designer. Because I had applied arts. I chose applied arts to be as useful as I can with the skills that I have. And I failed. And my dad came to Paris and he picked me up and he said, you have two choices. You go back to Beirut or you go to Montreal and you have a proper education. But I want to stay here. I want to be an artist. No, you have two choices. You can't stay here. And so I left to Montreal and I kept close touch with a new teacher that I met in Paris. His name is Patrick André and his artist name is Patrick André depuis 1966, which means Patrick André since 1966, which was his art practice. And he was our conceptual teacher. I kept in touch with him for 7 years. I continued to build my practice through our correspondence as I was in Montreal. But the first thing that I noticed when I left the East to the West through this whole experience of trying to be a designer, was realizing that I came with radical generosity. That was part of my culture. Radical generosity. For example, I'll feed you, I'll help you. I'm not expecting anything out of it because I know that through my culture, we both share this radical generosity. We're going to compete on generosity. But in the West, there's no such thing. The first thing that I had to learn that I didn't know before was that I'm going to be taken advantage of all the time that I practice radical generosity. It will never be reciprocated. Until this day, I struggle with this because it's true that it's not part of the West's culture to reciprocate any form of generosity. It's not going to be reciprocated. And that's the first thing that I had to reckon with. I had two choices. One is I become austere, just like them, or I continue being radically generous, but I find ways to protect myself from disappointments. And those are the things that I reckon with being from the East and living in the West. I feel like a lot of these conversations I was able to find peace with my indigenous peers, because the idea of radical generosity is a concept in indigenous culture. There's a book called The Gift that's very beautiful that talks a lot about that and about the exploitation that was just normalized in the global North, about just how it's just part of, it's part of the entitlement that I don't understand.
Let's end on the subject of colonialism. So much of your work is about an anti-colonial education as a sort of means toward narrative change and highlighting various cultural erasures. So kind of just showing how colonialism has wrapped its serpent tail around so many areas and succeeded and expanded in all these ways. I use the word succeed there in the sense that it is omnipresent. And now that you've had Slow Factory for a decade plus, what are your views in terms of decolonization reaching the mainstream, whether that's celebrities, politicians, corporations? This year it was at least mentioned in the 2022 IPCC report. So some in the global North are finally starting to see colonialism as the root cause or problem that it is.
Yeah, there's a great piece of information that we share at the Slow Factory. It's a white paper by Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it talks about the fact that decolonization is essentially land back. There is no other way around decolonization. Of course, we need to decolonize certain thought processes, education, and so on, but it cannot be used as a metaphor and a pacifying way to just keep things as they are. We've seen that there has been a co-opting of these terms, decolonization. Now there's decolonize your makeup routine and decolonize your hair and decolonize your dance moves and all of these things where you're like, what are you talking about? Decolonization is about land back. That's the foundational knowledge piece that needs to be retained from this. And for the Slow Factory, that is what we work towards. It's a political movement. It is a political movement. And what does that look like? Of course, that's what we're developing. That's what we are here for. That's what Applied Utopia is for. That's why we are applying radical imagination. Of course, we're not the only ones who are doing all this. It must be led by indigenous groups, and especially here in North America, where we are on unceded territory. Indigenous people are still here. They're everywhere. They're not a relic of the past. There are so many different communities that are actively working and writing and creating. So that's what it means, decolonization. It's not like a romantic concept that is impossible to fathom. We're practically applying it.
And I think it should be said, one of the really interesting things about the work you do is you do apply some level of aesthetic rigor to this communication in a way that really resonates with particularly like millennial and Gen Z without it being, I don't even have a good word for it, but
pink washed or green washed or pastel washed.
Yeah, or just like, sort of lame faux billboard. You're providing meaning and getting information and wisdom across in a way that's still beautiful. And I think whether we're talking about the climate crisis or certain things related to just the not so sexy parts of our reality and still somehow making them beautiful or to a certain extent sexy, that's a really hard line to toe. And so I was wondering how you kind of navigate that in the work that you do, because there is this feeling, at least when I look at it, where I don't feel like it's watered down or lame because it's also beautiful. I think you find a way to make it both that's actually meaningful.
Yeah. A friend of mine, a peer of mine, Jess Chung, said to us after visiting the activation we did at MoMA PS1 called The Revolution is a School, she texted me and she said, "You're making the revolution accessible." And I thought, that's beautiful. If that's what we're doing, that's very good. That's a good contribution. We're very concerned about the contribution that we're making. We see our privilege as responsibility. We don't see it as something bad that you need to hit yourself for. We see it as a radical responsibility. Every single person that has a privilege has a responsibility. It doesn't have a layer of shame to me. It has a layer of responsibility, and that is action. What are you doing with your privilege? Are you contributing? How are you contributing? Because we're all contributing, whether we like it or not. We are part of this together. So we are concerned of that the most.
So beauty, in a way, is access. It is the entry point for a lot of people, which is interesting because I feel like it's the tool that a lot of people might eye roll about, but you do it in a way that's like just beautiful enough.
I mean, beauty, it's funny you say that because we have different strategies at Slow Factory. We have a strategy that we call lo-fi, that's actually memes. You know, meme culture is very, very important. And sometimes we post things that are purposefully not beautiful. Like that would be considered trash, basically. Like that would be considered like lo-fi, pixelated, trashy content. But sometimes we work with that content as well. We work with memes. The lo-fi is also part of like posting a screenshot of a Twitter, screenshot of something we found that's completely hideous, but that has a message in it. So no, it's not just beautiful, I think. And if you look at the grid that we managed to create on Instagram, you would see that it's not like other folks that are co-opting the movement in a lot of ways that are a bit too vanilla to my taste, If you are talking about decolonization, you're talking about free Palestine. You're talking about abolishing the police, and you're talking about abolishing the carceral system. Can we have this conversation, please? Because decolonization is not a cute t-shirt.
Yeah, it's not a cute t-shirt, and yet it can be an aesthetic experience that balances all these different voices, all these different perspectives. I wanted to end on this notion of liberation, which stems out of this. And what does a world of true liberation look like to you?
Oh, that's the question, the vision that we have and that we are continuing to develop is through the space of ease and comfort and abundance and expansion. It's very hard to feel those things when you're frontline. We're doing a deep ecology retreat this summer. We have been invited by the Oahu water protectors in Hawaii, and we are going to be exploring this notion of liberation together, at the same time being of service to their fight. But through these ideas of collective healing and collective well-being, we're conducting several retreats this year to slow down and to really work from this place of what does it feel like when you're free? I don't know, I don't think I know. I don't think I know because I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling free. And so we've done several retreats, and we're continuing to do so even more with different practitioners and healers and organizers and designers to really try to figure out. And the question is, what does the world look like when you're free, when you're feeling free? I don't know. I mean, we are building a school for collective liberation at the same time that we are liberating ourselves from internalized colonialism, internalized racism, internalized oppression that has been passed down to us from our families, even if we are families from immigrant background, I think that we all have to reckon with this internalization of colonialism. That's how we become free. It's a journey. I don't have an answer yet. But maybe in a year when the school will open, we'll invite you and maybe we'll have more insights to share.
I would love that. Thank you, Céline. It was so great to have you in the studio today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Extra thanks to our Season 6 sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison, Van Cleef, and Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can listen to our other podcasts at a distance by heading to atadistancepodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. And if you like our programs, please be sure to subscribe and leave comments. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Zhang, and Johnny Simon.